welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Brendan Flanagan. He is an emergency physician and he wrote the Kevin MD article, What Medicine Can Learn from the Anti-Work Movement. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I have what I would describe as a very traditional and boring path to where I am today. So I was one of those kids that always knew I wanted to be a doctor, very quickly found my calling in emergency medicine, and kind of went straight from college to medical school to residency. And I'm currently attending at a large academic center now. And I think I should clarify, just because of the content of my article, that I do fundamentally love my job. And I'm not just saying that in case my boss may be listening, but as we'll get into later, there are some things about medicine overall that I think could benefit from more of an anti-work standpoint.
Now, you mentioned you had a pretty traditional path to where you are today, and you knew pretty early on that you wanted to become a doctor. Has medicine been what you expected?
You know, I don't think medicine has quite been what anyone expected when they signed up for it, but I will say that I do still find like a true sense of joy from the practice of medicine that I imagined feeling back when I signed up for it. I think there have been obviously some things that are more challenging that I did not anticipate, but I will say that fundamental sense of like satisfaction from helping people, I do think that remains in medicine today.
So you're an emergency physician. Can you share some of these unexpected challenges that you may not have thought of, and share some of the rewards of emergency medicine today?
Absolutely. So emergency medicine is always quite challenging, but it's been especially so during the past 2 years of the pandemic. I think, you know, the challenges are quite obvious in that we're dealing with extremely high volumes right now. It can be anyone, anything, anytime. That's kind of the standard logo for emergency medicine. I think the rewarding part is I get to use like a wide breadth of my medical knowledge to take care of the patients in front of me. And of course, some of the frustrations are always in emergency medicine, not having the resources that you would like to take care of the patients in front of you.
All right, let's talk about your Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled, What Medicine Can Learn from the Anti-Work Movement. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Absolutely.
So I first became aware of the anti-work movement sometime around the fall of last year when it was receiving a lot of press coverage. For those of your audience who don't spend the pathologic amount of time on the internet that I do, I'll just kind of summarize the anti-work movement quickly. So it's best encapsulated by the anti-work subreddit, which is an increasingly popular subreddit. This forum, employees who are primarily from lower wage service level jobs share stories of how frustrated they are with their employers. They share fantasies of quitting. They share actual stories of quitting. And they kind of, the connecting theme is that they challenge the role that work ought to play in our lives and if it should dominate so much of our lives in such an extreme way. And I was very curious about the reaction that I was having to this forum because I absolutely loved it. I couldn't get enough of it, reading all the stories, and found myself really commiserating with the people behind these stories. And I was very curious about that reaction because on surface level, I don't have a lot in common with the people who are writing these stories. So I'm fortunate enough to be working at like what is relatively a much higher wage job, and you know, a job that people respect for the most part. You know, I think there's this stigma against lower wage employees that the reason their jobs are miserable is because, you know, they are working in a lower level job. And if they just worked harder or went back to school or achieved more in our meritocratic system, then they would get a job that they are happier with. But here I was with what I would literally describe as my dream job. And I was still empathizing with these people and their stories. And that got me thinking that there was probably more of a common thread in the toxic work culture that they were describing in this forum and in the work culture of medicine.
No, completely agree with you. And we talk a lot about clinician burnout on this podcast and on my site. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of physicians are burning out is really a lack of autonomy or decreasing lack of autonomy, and the fact that physicians feel like they don't have an answer to just going to the clinic or going to the hospital and just working their shifts and coming home. So we have a lot of doctors talk about burnout, about empowering themselves where they can cut down a little bit and not be so consumed by the work hours that medicine demands of them. So what's your thoughts about this movement as it applies to medicine and healthcare? Are physicians able to embrace more of this anti-work movement?
Yeah, so I think I should clarify that I'm not necessarily advocating that any physicians go out and quit their jobs.
Yeah.
I think that might be the correct path for some people. It's going to vary individual by individual, but I think in just a very general sense, we will always need doctors, and there will always be people who are inspired to provide medical care, and that's a good thing. I think what medicine can learn from the anti-work movement is kind of challenging the assumptions about what role work being medicine should play in all of our lives. So I remember very distinctly when I was a medical student on my surgical rotation, I was given a textbook on surgery. And the preface for this textbook was advice to medical students on what differentiates a regular medical student versus an honors medical student. And the line that I'll always remember was, the honors medical student never wants to leave the hospital. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think you could probably argue like, oh, that textbook's probably very dated and we've evolved since then. But I think that ethos of never wanting to leave the hospital and that being the model for how a physician should approach their job persists in many different specialties, not just surgery. I see it in my own specialty. I see it across the board in medicine. The other thing about medicine is that it's so inextricably tied with our identity. So we are encouraged not to see what we do as just a job. It is a calling. It is a passion. It is something that you are meant to do. And it's actually implied that you wouldn't be happy doing anything else if you have this calling. And I think anti-work can kind of inspire us to challenge that assumption, to find things outside of the clinic, outside of the hospital that inspire us, that give us a source of meaning and identity, and knowing that that does not make you a deficient doctor or a deficient caregiver that way.
So that conventional view of the doctor never wanting to leave the hospital and having medicine be a consuming part of their lives, do you think that contributes to the increasing level of physician burnout today?
I think it absolutely does. You know, burnout is a particular area of interest of mine. And one common theme that I find about burnout is that it is, despite it being so prevalent, it is also extremely isolating. And physicians who are experiencing burnout often feel marginalized by their practice community, even though so many doctors are going through the exact same thing. And I think part of the reason for that is that medicine is a profession that thrives on enthusiasm and hard work. And if you are feeling, for whatever reason, like you cannot bring that sense of enthusiasm and hard work to your job, you are made to feel that you are doing something wrong, that you are letting your team down, that you are letting your patients down. And I think that sense, that incompatibility of various levels of passion for your work with medicine, the fact that medicine has to be all or nothing, I think is a huge contributor to burnout. And I think that this leads to burnout in a number of ways. And one of them is that I think it makes burnout especially isolating as an experience, even though paradoxically it is so prevalent within the physician community. So if you are experiencing burnout, I think it is very often perceived as a deficiency of enthusiasm or altruism on your part. You are seen as letting your team down, letting your patients down, and kind of being, like, for lack of a better word, a bad doctor. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write the article was that I think anti-work can kind of help reframe that. So anti-work can make you feel okay with your desire to leave the hospital.
Now, how can we normalize that? Because I always encourage physicians not to define themselves 100% as a physician, unless, certainly for some that's their calling and more power to them. But for the vast majority of physicians, like you said, you want them to have passions outside of clinical medicine because that is one of the ways to combat burnout. But on the other hand, they're seen as not as committed, like you said, a proverbial bad doctor and not spending 100% of that time in the hospital. So there's a little bit of a conflict in terms of the response. And how do you advise physicians to navigate through those emotions?
I think a large part of normalizing it comes from simply talking about it. So conversations like this one and other conversations that you might have with colleagues who are experiencing burnout to some degree. The pandemic has accelerated so many of these trends in medicine and kind of laid bare a lot of the problems that were there to begin with, but are now so much worse. And I think one of the upsides of that is that virtually everyone who has worked in the past 2 years has experienced some type of burnout to some degree. And so it has very much normalized the experience. And I think people are talking about it more. And it also seems like this is a moment where there is more collective bargaining power for workers, not just in medicine, but across the economy. And I'm optimistic that that might lead to better working conditions for workers of all types, including those in medicine.
We're talking to Brendan Flanagan. He's an emergency physician, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, What Medicine Can Learn from the Anti-Work Movement. Brendan, we've been talking about burnout in the medical profession for years now. Have you noticed that the needle is being moved from a healthcare leader standpoint or from an administrator standpoint? Are they taking physician burnout more seriously than they once did?
I certainly see more of an effort, at least compared to when I was in medical training. And at least burnout is recognized as kind of a problem more on the scale with what I think it truly is now. So you will at least see, efforts made by administration and healthcare leadership. Now, whether those efforts are adequate, I think you can kind of break it down on an individual level. I think overall the answer is clearly still no, because you clearly still have all these physicians who are burning out. What I am hopeful for is that beyond the efforts that are being made by healthcare leadership and administration, kind of powers that are outside of our control, is I'm hoping that this moment of pervasive burnout in medicine will inspire a lot of doctors to kind of reevaluate the role that they think that work should play in their lives. I think medicine is an amazing job, but it can still be just a job. And like any other job, it's important to set healthy boundaries between your work and the rest of your life.
Now, can you give us a story or an example of doing that, reevaluating medicine's role in a physician's life? Is there a success story that you can share with the audience?
I like to think, this is obviously still a work in progress for me, like it is for everyone, but I like to think that I have a healthier attitude towards my own job in the past 2 years. I still very much take pride in the work I do in the emergency department as a doctor, but I frequently try to redefine myself in ways that are not exclusive to me being a doctor. I try to put more effort into my family, more effort into my hobbies, more effort into engaging with my community in ways that are not just medicine. And one thing that I have resolved to do more, which is part of the reason I wrote the article, is to talk about this more. Because as we were saying earlier, I think this type of change in a culture that is as intransigent at times as medical culture is only possible when you start having these conversations.
And was that journey to redefining yourself, how difficult was that for you?
I think I went through a very difficult time at the beginning of pandemic, as everyone working in healthcare probably did. And, there are still days that I very much struggle with balancing my role as a caregiver with my role in everything else in my life. I do think that now I can honestly say that I have a better balance now. I am more likely to advocate for my own personal time outside of the hospital. I am more comfortable saying no. I'm asked to do extra at work. And most importantly, I no longer feel like a bad doctor when I do have to say no and when I do have to advocate for myself.
And just to give expectations for those listening to this podcast, how long did it take you before you felt a little bit more comfortable saying no and being more comfortable with these new boundaries?
It definitely was not immediate, and I cannot say with 100% truthfulness that I am even all there yet. I still sometimes feel like the regular medical student instead of the honors medical student, and I still, I'm fortunate to work at a place that has, amazing colleagues who are at the top of their game, and I still oftentimes feel inadequate and like I should be contributing more to my job. Movements like anti-work have kind of encouraged me to reevaluate that mindset more and to kind of provide a cognitive stop, if you will, when I go down that path of feeling inadequate, of feeling like a bad doctor, and reminding myself that I can be more than one thing.
And I think we do need to remember that both the regular and the honors medical students eventually will become doctors.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Yeah, so again, I would reiterate that I think medicine can be an extremely rewarding job, but I would encourage us to see it more as a job. And I think there's nothing wrong with feeling like it is your calling and your passion, but oftentimes when we define it that way, we allow our work to encroach on our personal lives in ways that end up being harmful for us down the road. And so I would just reiterate that I love my job, but I do still see it as a job. And there is more to me than just the work that I do.
Brendan, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.